are. Sorry, my computer has not been keeping up at all. Yes, we are good. Okay, what's going on, everyone? Hound the Forge here. So yesterday I had a debate with Miss MxVivianWulf, moderated by Destiny. What's going on, everyone? Basically, didn't go the way I had planned it to go. I kind of thought that she would be more apprehensive to say that trans athletes actually had an advantage. She kind of caved really quickly on that, but I honestly didn't even think about the kind of comparative advantage that other athletic features or body features give you in different sports, because for me it just didn't seem like there was anything that kind of came quantitatively even close to testosterone in power sports. So they gave me some good things to think about, and I actually did. And so now I'm going to go over the whole conversation again and see if I can try and rebut arguments that I didn't make, or rebut arguments that I now know that I should have, and kind of concede what I think I learned. Let's do this.
Okay, so real quickly before we start, the topic that we're going over is broadly just trans athletes, and then do each of you want to introduce yourselves, give your position, and then we can start chatting, and then go first, Vivian. Go.
Sure, yeah, I'm MxVivianWulf on Twitch, Twitter, and YouTube. I do generally historical and anti-fascist content on Twitch, but
I hope you guys can keep up,
trans,
but
so I get roped into these conversations.
I'm going to watch this a bit quicker.
Yeah, I think that's. I think. Oh, my position. My position is that the current rules around gender segregation in sport are not good. Actually, they are pretty unfair.
This is one thing that I
trans people
didn't get to ask her about, is when she said the rules aren't fair towards trans people. I don't understand how that's actually possible, because right now it's at 10 nanomoles per liter, which is still like 2, 4, 6, 8, so like almost 5 times as much as a non-DSD cis female would ever be able to achieve. So I don't know how that's discriminatory, because any trans athlete that would be transitioning would, I don't think there's any way pretty much everything that they would take would more or less completely drain the testosterone out of their body to like even below normal. And so having it that high, I think, is kind of dangerous, actually, because it would allow an athlete to, if they really wanted to, keep their testosterone levels higher, which again isn't the main problem that I have, but just throwing it out there as a kind of beginning thing, which we didn't touch on.
Sex, trans men, and so on, and that if we're going to have any kind of conversation around changing those rules around segregation, it should be done with inclusivity in mind, with the idea of getting more people involved and able to compete in sport, rather than excluding trans women from it because they are not a threat to cis women's sport.
All right, the Hound, hit us up. Who are you? What's your position?
I go by Hound the Forge on YouTube and Twitch. I'm going to be streaming more regularly after this is released. My position is basically that in sports, there's a breakdown of systems and physiological attributes used. I think
my mic is shit.
Goes into anaerobic and aerobic exercise. I basically believe that the male advantage that is conferred from a cis male on puberty.
Holy shit! Cutting out a lot.
I didn't realize that I was cutting out. Holy fuck!
Puberty, and then what?
And then that will give them an overwhelming advantage, even later in life, even when testosterone is out of their system.
Okay.
My
all right.
connection's so fucking bad here.
You guys can just talk. So basically, the way that I do this is I don't like take a side on the argument. If I feel like one of you guys is missing the point that the other person is saying, I'll try to help the other person clarify, or I'll try to get a response to the other person. If you guys start calling each other names or shouting at each other, I'll step in, etc., etc. Okay, go hit yourselves up. Go for it.
Sounds good. All right. Well, I mean, I guess you'd have to start by stating your premise and the evidence for your premise. Like, yeah.
Yeah. So I almost want to just kind of like a little preamble here and just say that because I don't want people coming and seeing this and thinking that I'm some kind of just transphobe. I know I probably won't convince many people beforehand, but I just think that like I believe in trans rights. I believe that trans people should have protections under the law, and that they should be considered a protected class. Bigotry is real and damaging a societal problem. So yeah, and that's taken care of.
Okay.
Basically, I believe that there is enough evidence to show that or males who go through male puberty have
Holy shit, my mic's
go
fucking
through
bad.
their own puberty.
Wait, hold on, wait, real quick. Are you
yeah,
using push to talk?
No, I tried it, but it wasn't. One sec.
Yeah, can
Try it
we
again.
try just for a second? The mic is cutting out quite a bit.
I gotta fix my fucking setup. Okay. Anyways, basically what I said was that obviously trans rights exist. Trans people are real. We shouldn't discriminate trans people just on the basis of their transness. We have to base it on, or we don't have to base it on, but like I believe that if we do base sports on testosterone levels, then, which we do kind of implicitly, then this poses a problem for trans athletes.
A bit now. Hold on.
Okay.
Yeah. But if I have to summarize your position, it would be that people who go through a male puberty have, would you say, an unfair advantage in sport? Is that your,
Yes.
like, in system in sport? Okay,
Yes.
cool. So what do you mean by unfair? What makes it unfair?
I'm just switching up. Can you still hear me, or is it still cutting out really bad?
No, this sounds way better now.
Yeah, that's much
Okay.
better. It's not clipping out as much.
Okay.
Right.
So what I mean by unfair is that in the Olympics already they have rules that basically state that you can't use PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs.
Yep.
So my kind of standard is that if we look at kind of basically how much advantage is conferred from using a PED, if the level at which being a male to you doesn't bring you down to that level or lower, then it's not fair to allow them to compete in the women's category.
Doesn't bring you down to the level that is fair. So what you're saying is that the endogenous testosterone produced by trans women during puberty should be considered a PED.
Yes.
Because that sounds like a really strange classification to me. It would mean that is literally the only endogenous thing that we would ever consider to be a performance-enhancing drug. You know the difference between endogenous and exogenous, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That's kind of true, but not really, as we know with Caster Semenya's case. As far as we know, the court did order her to take a testosterone suppression substance. So it's not entirely true, but it is mostly true.
Okay, so yeah.
Wait,
And
clarifying
so,
for the audience. So endogenous, I'm guessing, is something produced within the body. Exogenous is something taken from without the body into the body.
yeah, that's correct.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so that would be like the only thing, and it seems it would be targeted like specifically at trans women. So you'd have to have a pretty high bar of evidence to suggest that this is like creates some degree of unfairness in order to like enact policies to remove trans women's right to compete in sport.
For sure. Okay, so I'll kind of lay out my case a little bit better here. So the normal adult male range for testosterone is between 7.7 and 29.4 nanomoles per liter. 75% of athletes found in a bunch of different studies are usually over 10 nanomoles per liter. We know that for most females it's 0.13 to 1.79 nanomoles per liter. So and depending on what sport you're looking at, for power sports there has been some studies that have shown that about.
So cut out again. Shows that about. Carry on.
That
Okay, so this is where we kind of got mixed up in transition, because later on, I guess she didn't, or clearly she couldn't hear that I said that the max range is 2.0 nanomoles per liter. Yeah, and so obviously the reason I'm doing this is to show that there's a massive gap between non-DSD cis females and non-DSD cis males, which is the dominant individuals in the population.
About 2 nanomoles per liter is level for. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it shows that about between 7 and 50%. There's between 7 and 50 times below the same amount of testosterone in males compared to females. Right. So this is basically a beyond biological level of what you'd expect a normal or a.
Sure, but
athlete.
plenty of male champion athletes have testosterone within the female range. Like this isn't the performance enhancement conferred by testosterone isn't about the amount of testosterone in the blood. So one of the reasons that I consider the current policies, in fact, to be pretty unfair is that it's about the amount of testosterone that the body uptakes, right? Like the amount you can use. This is why you end up with people like Caster Semenya, for example, who has like androgen. Sorry, no, not Caster Semenya. Who am I thinking of? Ah, crap, I can't think of an example off the top of my head. But this is why you end up with people who have like.
I'm not actually sure if she's thinking of either, but I don't think there's anyone who kind of is not DSD who has this problem. Yeah.
Androgen insensitivity syndrome, for example, you can have like XY chromosomes have a sort of normal male range of testosterone in the blood, but still be sort of phenotype. Typically, their physical attributes expressed as female, because the body isn't uptaking all that testosterone in their blood.
There's a huge correlation between the free testosterone in the blood and the amount of uptake, and so usually you see those together, right?
Yeah, there is a correlation between it, but it's not.
Well,
not
it's unusual to see it
universal
not
every
happening.
Yeah, I'd say if you have more testosterone in the blood, your body's more likely to uptake more. But like I said, there are a number of like male athletes in elite sport who have very low testosterone blood levels and still like perform very, very well because their uptake is extremely high.
I don't want to like take a side on this, and I'm not gonna like scream.
So, listen to what Destiny says.
Like sources throughout this,
I'll
I
comment again.
find it very, 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 very hard to believe that there are competitive male athletes with female levels of testosterone just based on how I know testosterone functions. It kind of sounds like testosterone is like a meme, but it's definitely not. Like this is literally like what
testosterone isn't a meme. But your ability, it's not it's the amount of testosterone in the blood is not the measure by which it works, because you can have like testosterone in the blood that simply isn't being like used by the body.
For sure. That's why if you go to like a male fertility clinic or some shit, they can't just measure the testosterone and tell you if you have high or low T. That's why they usually look for symptoms first if it's a responsible doctor, right? Because but I don't know if there are male professional athletes that have female levels of testosterone in their blood. That seems highly unlikely to me.
Right. So
I would have to go and Google the source for that.
Okay, sure. All right, go.
There's research that shows that it is true in some sports the levels are extremely overlapping, but that's why I kind of made a differentiation at the very beginning between anaerobic sports, because more often than not, testosterone differences are very large in these specific sports, which are the only sports I would actually consider putting restrictions on trans athletes.
Sure.
Okay, well, I didn't hear you make that. I think your mic must have cut out when you were saying about anaerobic sports. So by anaerobic, you're talking about stuff that isn't like running, swimming, etc. Yes. You're talking about weightlifting and so
there's two forms of anaerobic kind of activity. So they say about a maximum of 2 minutes of.
There's 2 minutes is what I said before my mic cut out.
Extreme vigorous exercise is like the limit. After that, it's pretty much mostly aerobic.
Okay.
So so this would be like maximum a 200-meter dash. If you're thinking of running, weightlifting, shot put, javelin throw, high jump, long jump, those kinds of things.
All right. So like just bursts of strength rather than.
Yeah.
Okay, I got you. All right, and so what's the contention there? Because trans women would have to keep their testosterone like at a level below. I think the IOC puts it at either 4 or 2 nanomoles per liter, right?
It's
for like 2 years.
The Olympic Committee is still at 10. They're trying to bring it down to 5, but they haven't actually made that decision yet. Yeah,
cool. So below 10 nanomoles per liter for 2 years, yeah.
Okay, so I have a study, and it's not been looked at because it is a mouse study. But what they basically did is they took 2 female mice. They gave one testosterone, another one sham pellets. Trained both of them for 6 weeks, and they detrained them. They let them not train at all for another 6 weeks, which came to almost a decade in human time if you look at the comparative lifespan. And they retrained them, and what they found is, without any testosterone, just normally, what they found is that the mice that had the testosterone, that are in the testosterone condition, they had a 30% increase in power and muscle size compared to the sham one. And so I kind of think of this as saying, like, if you had gone through a period where you're training and you're going through a typical cis male puberty, this elevated testosterone would give you basically what they're doing was growing more myonuclei, which have been found.
Benefits that last much longer, essentially, is what you're saying.
Yeah,
right?
they're theorized to last decades, even a lifetime in most cases.
Okay. Yeah. So so why should I care?
I don't know why she said that. Why should I care? But yeah, the point I was trying to make there was that these benefits aren't ephemeral. That in a lot of cases they last. In this study, they did it up to a decade, but the levels were still near the same amount. And of course, we actually know that the muscle memory phenomena happens in humans. There have been studies that have showed that this does happen. If you train, stop training, you retrain, you gain muscle quicker and strength quicker. There just hasn't been a controlled study like with mice where they did it, where they had one group taking a certain amount of testosterone and one group not taking any testosterone. But I mean, if you already have the same phenomenon, I don't see how it would not happen. It's just kind of the quantitative extent to which it would happen if it's kind of the same or less than the mice. But I'm pretty sure that mice are actually less sexually dimorphic than humans are. We have male and females have much more different traits in our species than theirs. So I would actually contest that the strength differences would be much larger. Yeah.
So basically, if we can see that people or athletes have gotten that advantage, if that advantage overshadows the advantage you gain, or is near it to the advantage you gain from taking a certain kind of steroid or something like that, then that's basically, again,
I mean, I simply reject the idea that like having a male puberty is anything like taking a PED. You could probably make the argument like maybe philosophically or whatever that there's some kind of analogy there, perhaps. But to say it's like it would be to validate those accusations of like cheating against trans women who compete in sport.
Well,
And it's
we already recognize that.
demonstrably not, because they're not taking like an exogenous substance to increase their performance. If anything, they're taking an exogenous substance which decreases their performance, right?
Yeah, for sure. But I think so would you be okay with athletes that have or actually, I think we already answered this question. Basically, that have genetic advantages which are abnormal, and then give them an extreme advantage in some kind of discipline, like Michael Phelps. I know he had a genetic disorder.
I'm totally okay with that. Sports is inherently kind of like unfair, if you like, right? Because yeah, the entire point of like going and doing training is to gain a like unfair competitive advantage, or at least a competitive advantage over your opponents, right? Like how much time you have in the day available to be able to train could be considered an unfair competitive advantage. Like, so you have to demonstrate, I think, that the unfair competitive advantage that is conferred from male puberty is so drastic.
Okay, yeah, so this is where I think she was kind of getting, I guess, a little bit off my central point, which that, yeah, that's true that if you train more than someone else, that's a competitive advantage. But the point is that there's nothing that they can't do to train more. So, of course, this gets into questions of autonomy and time and, I don't know, economic status and stuff like that, is how much time you actually have to train. But I think the central point is that if you make time to train more, you can catch up to them, where there's nothing that a cis female could do to catch up to a trans woman in testosterone. There's, unless taking an illicit or a PED, a substance. So the difference isn't as, I guess, straightforward, or, well, the difference isn't the same at all, to be honest. Yeah.
Right, that it removes the ability for like any other athletes outside of that category to compete. And even then, I mean, we still allow Michael Phelps to compete, so what is it specifically about the male puberty that makes it exceptional compared to like any other kind of competitive advantage that somebody might have, either through genetics or just through life circumstance?
Well, again, I go back to the differences, the innate differences between cis women and men's testosterone amounts. And when you kind of look at that, if you have a training advantage, that you have this much amount of extra testosterone that would never be achievable
Cool.
by a female athlete, then that's just, you just have that much more advantage throughout your body for the rest of your life.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm not convinced that this advantage confers the same as a cis male's advantage over a woman when you're taking that, because
It's not, that's all I'm trying to prove, is that it's the same. I'm saying is that it's more than the substances that we already ban in the sport. So if we're saying, okay, you shouldn't take this substance because it's gonna enhance your performance by this amount, which will give you a competitive advantage, then why would we not do the same with basically the same hormone? So if we say, okay, you take this, increases your testosterone, it's going to give you this much of a performance boost, but then we say for trans athletes, you don't have to worry about that because, I mean, I get it, it's a discrimination problem, which we'll talk about later on, but the logic is pretty consistent that if you care about this, and I think you should care about that as well, even if you don't want to change the way things are, you almost have to admit that it is an advantage and it is a technically unfair advantage. It's an unbridgeable gap. Yeah.
Because trans women athletes don't just like have testosterone during puberty and then come off the testosterone. They like actively take estrogen to like lower those levels. They lose muscle mass. Like there is.
No, yeah, for sure. But okay, then do you deny the study that I told you about before?
I mean, you were talking about a couple of mice, one
right,
which was given testosterone, and then they were kind of like left alone, right, without the exogenous testosterone. And like the mouse that was given testosterone had some advantages that were conferred for like you said possibly up to decades longer, right?
Yeah, there's theorized
but
lifetime as well.
Theorized to be for the lifetime, yeah, sure. But
so
like,
would you be more receptive to a study that was done on humans? Like if they showed the same finding in humans, what would you think about?
What I would, yeah, I mean, in humans it would probably be a lot more relevant for sure. I am aware of a couple of studies that have been done with humans who have been who have been through transition, and that they sort of end up placing around the same sort of position, right, pre and post transition generally.
I should have called her out on this because I know exactly which study she's talking about. I think the author is Joanna Harper or Joanne Harper or something like that. She looked specifically at endurance athletes. So it wasn't actually relevant to my central question, if that's the study she's talking about, but yeah.
I have some examples of the opposite happening if you want to go over them.
Sure.
So Laurel Hubbard is probably one that pretty much everyone knows. Basically, before she competed, she actually had the men's 105 division world record for New Zealand with a snatch of 135 kilograms, clean and jerk 170, total 300 kilograms.
Cool. So she had the men's record before transitioning.
Right. So she transitioned. Yes. Now her, I guess I'll tell you, her overall was just 285. So her previous record was 300, and that's a 15 kilogram total drop, which is a 5% performance drop. So then we go to, there's another paper here that looked at the comparative differences between athletes in sports. What they found was that between males and females, there was a 36.8% increase or difference between the two.
Right.
So basically what I'm saying is that the percentage of drop, which happened to Laurel Hubbard through the transitioning process, wasn't enough to...
This is an average difference though, right? Like the 36% between like men and women in weightlifting is like averaged across all people. Yeah.
No, it's not. It's done by the records of the sport. They compare the records over the years.
Oh, right. So like the highest achievable.
The highest achievable, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So Laura Hubbard has like a 5% performance drop. How long was it between her initial transition and like when she competed to get the new record?
I think she was around 20, so she probably actually wasn't at her peak when she got that record. She actually transitioned at 34 years old, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
I think what Vivian was asking, or my understanding is she was asking, how long was her transition before she started setting female records? Like, did she transition on Monday and then Friday set the women's record, or did she wait? I think it's usually 2 years is like the recommended transition time.
It's been 8 years, and this is her current stats.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. Yeah, again, I mean, I just have to be like, I don't know why this is like a major issue. Laura Hubbard's been barred from competing anyway.
So she hasn't been. I don't know if she was just kind of internally panicking a little bit, but Laura Hubbard still can compete. Still is competing.
Like, and we do this sometimes when we have people who do have such a like competitive advantage. Like they will change the rules, right? Like with what was it, Kobe Bryant? I think they changed some of the rules in NBA for him, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since I looked into this, to be honest.
I'm not exactly sure, but do you want to go over another example? I have one more kind of.
Yeah, sure.
So do you know CC?
Yeah, I'm not sure who she's talking about. I've heard, I can't remember who it was, but there was a really tall basketball player, and they did do something to the rules because of it. But yeah, I don't know how that's relevant. That's kind of a red herring.
Tefler.
Nice.
She was a CAA. Yeah, no. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go.
Okay.
Oh yeah, someone in the chat said it was Shaq. Yeah.
How'd you spell her name?
CEEELFER.
Sorry, say that again. CEE.
CECE.
All right, okay.
Yeah, Tefler. TELFER.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so before she transitioned in 2016 in the hurdles, she ranked 200th place and then 390th in 2017. Then after she transitioned, I think she waited a year or a year and a half, and she is consistently either coming in the top 10 or like top several places. Okay. And when I looked at her actual scores, her 400 hurdle competing pre-transition was 57.34 seconds. Post, it was 57.53. So that's a 0.3% difference. For her 60-meter personal, her personal best was pre-transition 7.67. Post, it was 7.63. That's a 0.5 difference. And then for 400-meter, superior 400-meter was 55.77 pre, 54.41 post, 0.4% difference.
Okay, so you got two examples of trans women coming through who outperform cis women, or outperform. I don't know how to.
That's not actually my contention. My contention is that basically where they were pre-transition and athletic ability doesn't fully transition over post-transition.
Sure. What you're saying is some benefits from male puberty remain, and
so I think the broad argument I think is he's saying there is a X% difference between the average elite male and female cis female athlete. But when we look at some of the highest performing male to female trans athletes, the percentage difference between their abilities and the elite male athletes is much smaller. Is based on the two examples I think we've heard thus far since the argument.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So there's no there's a competitive advantage that like transfers over. That's fine. I get that. And I've never contended that doesn't exist. I think
I'm pretty sure she did in her first or second debate with Destiny like last year, and so that's why I'm kind of when I came into this debate, I really prepared, expecting that she would try and counter this idea that there is an inherent unfairness. Just kind of bites the bullet on it.
The advantages I've never contended that doesn't exist. What I have contended is that like it isn't really a problem, right? Like Laurel Hubbard is like one trans woman. She's not like there are multiple other like categories in which women are doing perfectly fine, right? Like she just like one area. She did like the clean and jerk, and I think it was it the deadlift? I forget. But yeah,
no, they don't do
and
deadlift
so
and weightlifting.
like, but this hasn't precluded other women from competing at all, right?
Right, well, that's why my standard is PEDs. So if you I'm trying to show here that basically the level advantage that was conferred from male puberty was beyond that, or that you would have gotten from, or that any other athlete would have gotten from taking a PED.
Okay, cool.
And so if we care about PEDs, in the
Yeah.
sport, then
we
why
care,
would we
care about PEDs because PEDs can be like particularly widespread, right? And that it would force essentially every athlete
No
to
one
take
will hear
PEDs
this.
in order to
Thanks,
compete.
Steeps.
Whereas like trans women are such a small part of the population, such a small part of the elite sporting population, that like having one trans woman who like wins fairly regularly like doesn't actually do that much to the sport in general, right? It doesn't.
So I didn't actually think ever about the kind of consequentialist argument of PEDs, and that it kind of is true is that if you let one athlete do it, then you basically give every athlete to do it. So I guess that is true in a perspective I didn't actually think about, but then that would also mean that you give trans athletes the right to do it, and then if everyone's doing it and the percentage increase, the performance is the exact same, then we're still at the same problem, basically.
It doesn't like take away from women in general.
And to comment on the not that many trans women in sports, this is actually something that I didn't think was very important, but now I realize is. This is the main thing I was moved on. And so I actually, in the end, kind of do agree that if there isn't, you know, an abundance of sports athletes or of trans athletes that are, you know, breaking records or doing really well, then it's not a problem practically. It's just like there's a bunch of Michael Phelps out there that are doing really well in certain sports. But I guess as we talk about later on, it just kind of comes down to how many trans athletes are or eventually do dominate the sport. Because I really think that if that basically you have male performance as a distribution, female performance as a distribution, I believe that like if you know what a normal distribution is, it's just the bell. That the trans athlete or the trans female athlete distribution is not in between male and female, but maybe just slightly closer to female. And so, I mean, if you get 3% of the population that becomes trans, 3, 4, 5%, if that ever does happen for whatever reason, I could easily see there being like, you know, under half of the top 10 athletes being trans athletes in these specific sports. And so, I mean, that's the thing is that the line? Is that the limit? Is that the point at which we say, okay, I guess that's all right? I mean, I guess it is a philosophical question, and it is a question of discrimination. You know, it is true that if we say, okay, you guys can't compete anymore, then we're basically kicking them out of sport for reasons that are, and if this kind of goes back to if you believe that being trans is not actually a choice, which I do, then we're kicking you out of the sport for a choice or a reason that is beyond your control. You didn't choose to be trans, you were, depending on which way you look at it, I do see that there's a psychological and neuroscientific reasons to believe that transness is a psychological phenomena. So if we do say, okay, you didn't decide this, then we're just discriminating against you for reasons that are out of your control. So that's not exactly fair. So I guess the alternate perspective or way to look at this is, I guess, until there are enough trans athletes to make a trans league in that sport. But I just don't know how this will work on the public perspective more than anything. You know, it's going to be, I do think this is going to be a question that's going to come up in the future a lot. But I'll go over my full perspective on that at the end of the video.
I mean, if it depends, like, then I don't know. It depends on what your values of sport are. Like, if you believe that the value of or what someone called it tolerable unfairness is a thing, then you should kind of be, I'm guessing about this. Like, I think that if you say that this level is okay, then you shouldn't be upset if a low-ranked or mid-ranked athlete takes a PED and then doesn't come in first place or whatever, but bumps themselves up significantly.
Well, like I said, the problem with that is you have this sort of like rule utilitarian argument, right? Where you say that like PEDs are like a thing that all cis women could do in sport, right? Like,
Right.
whereas being a trans woman is not a thing that all cis women could do in sport, right?
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, we're not.
And so you sort of like initiate the rule so that like PEDs don't take over the sport. Whereas like there's currently no threat of like trans women taking over the sport currently.
Well, I'm not afraid of trans women taking over the sport, but just
right.
I think that's a genuine unfairness if trans women come into the sport and say they're not even like dominating, but just getting like places where they had a conferred advantage where they wouldn't have gotten it pre-transition in the previous category they're involved in.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like I said to you already, I agree that like male puberty can confer in some sports a competitive advantage post-transition. I honestly don't see how this is different from any other like competitive advantage, and also I don't see it as currently like any great threat to the structure. Right? It's not like forcing cis women out of the sport. Cis women are still competing. We don't have like all trans women podiums. Like that's,
okay.
that's
I mean,
not a thing that happens, right?
I mean, if that's your level of kind of concern, then.
Well, yeah, I mean, it comes down to your sort of like concept of fairness, right? Like the point of fairness isn't to make sure that absolutely everybody has no competitive advantage whatsoever. The point of fairness is that like, you know, that people are able to compete at the highest level, right, with others, and that they can appear and have a presence in that sport. Because there will always be people who have that great genetic advantage, like we talked about with Phelps and so on, right?
Okay, but I would be someone who would say that Phelps should basically do everything that's technologically possible to level out someone who has an unbridgeable advantage. So people
Why?
because that invalidates the concept of fairness, at least which I hold and which I think the Olympics itself holds, like what general sports fairness holds.
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure about the concept of fairness as described by the Olympic Committee. I was literally trying to fucking find a definition from them earlier, and it's really difficult to get like a solid definition of what they mean when they say fairness. In general, they try and stray away from the use of that word, except in describing why the policy is important. They say, you know, it's in order to ensure fairness in sport, but they have no like solid definition of what that is. And so it comes down to.
I can give you a definition from the World Anti-Doping.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
Basically, what they say is, so the list of banned drugs and performance enhancing methods are registered and blah 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 blah. There's 3 criteria: potentially performance enhancing, potentially harmful to the athlete's health, and violates the spirit of sport.
The spirit of sport.
Spirit of sport. Now I know that's super vague and arbitrary, but I think that's something that you're not fully caring about enough.
Well, I mean, what I care about is like the ability for people to be included in sport, right? So, like, for example, if you
so at this point I kind of realized that our fundamental values when it comes to sports are different. Just in and of themselves are completely different. I do not think that inclusion in sport is the most important thing. I think that that's not really why people play, especially in the elite level. That's not why people play sports. It's not why people watch sports. And that's not what sports are purporting to do, is give a inclusive games to be the most athletic and the most elite people in our society a chance to compete with each other on as much of a fair playing ground as they can possibly do. Within reason, of course. So yeah, I think that's just a value difference that we kind of have. And so I don't actually know how to bridge that, because as she kind of already talked about, the only way she would be kind of uncomfortable with trans athletes competing would be if there were like all of them on the podium, like top 10 all trans athletes in every single power sport. So that's obviously well before that would be my point where I'd be like, okay, this is a problem. But I think it's just a numbers game, really. It just depends on how many trans people there actually are in the world. If there's 3-4% of trans people in the world, and I don't even know what the numbers are of trans athletes in sports, but I do believe that there will be a higher percentage of them on the podium than there are compared to their actual population numbers. So like if there's 3% of them in the population, I could think upwards of like 30% in the power sports. So problem to me, but not a problem to some.
You were to say, if we were to take your argument to its logical conclusion, right, and say that like trans women are banned from competing in like women's sports that are like women's aerobic sports, right?
Right.
Sorry, anaerobic sports.
Anaerobic, right.
Yeah. Then you would essentially say that trans women are banned from competing in those sports, right? Without
No.
like completely restructuring how sport works currently.
Well, I actually don't think so. I would propose a women's unregulated category that's just tagged on, where any athlete who wants to compete in there and is legally a woman do it.
But I mean, but why? like I
Because
said,
they're
currently
trans.
it doesn't seem. Yeah, and so
When the
yeah, but so,
unregulated category essentially just be like, aren't you just making a trans only category at that point?
No,
So I actually would, I guess I kind of didn't think of the practicality of this, but it would kind of just be like trans and intersex people in that category. But my idea basically was that cis athletes who just don't believe or don't care or they have the perspective of inclusivity in sports. If they say, okay, I want to compete with the trans athletes because I want to stand with them, and I understand that there may be an advantage that they have, but I don't care about that. I'm still willing to compete with them. And then possibly even cis athletes who want to take illicit substances and compete. I basically unrestricted just means anything that they wouldn't do to grievously hurt themselves. And so there probably would be not that many people. But then, of course, we're only talking about not that many sports to begin with. So I don't know. It is hard to say how many people would actually go into the league, but that was just one solution I kind of came up with. But I do realize that if it really is true that we made that league and it's only trans athletes and cis and intersex or DSD athletes in those sports, that would be kind of unfair and kind of just segregating them. So yeah.
No, the point is that cis women who want to compete with the trans women can do it. It's unregulated. All you have to do is legally be.
Well, but like, let's say that you want to like win awards or like be at the top of your division. Why would you ever go into, if you're saying that we need to create this division because it's harder, which is the only reason we need to create this division is that there's an unfair grouping that's happening. If there is an unfair grouping, why would people choose to move from their what you consider a fair grouping to the unfair one where they don't have an advantage?
Okay, so I probably should have responded better than I did, but I would basically just say look at Vivian's perspective right there. She cares about inclusivity in sports. I bet you there are a lot of athletes that also value that, and so they would probably jump at the opportunity to support trans athletes and be able to compete at the same high level. Yeah.
Wouldn't it literally just be a trans only category effectively?
I think there are actually a lot of athletes. There are a lot of athletes that would show solidarity with the trans movement. And I think the problem is kind of a consent thing here. If female athletes want to compete with trans athletes, I think that they have the right to do that, and I think a lot of them actually would.
So why don't we do that with like black athletes as well? We should probably move black athletes to the to that unregulated thing as well, right? Because seems like, especially in running, for example, like we should probably have a category like that where like black athletes can compete in the running category, the open running category, and then we just leave like cis white athletes in the sort of like other running category, the official women's running category.
No, because there's no inherent advantage in black athletes that is not achievable by other males of other races.
Yes.
You sure about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if she didn't, I don't know how much she watches sports at all, or like running sports in general. There definitely is like a higher proportion of black athletes in the power, some power sports. Not all of them, but again, the point isn't that in practice there is more of a certain kind of person. It's just that that the advantage that they have isn't of the group. The advantage that they have of the group of individuals is not systematically aggressively higher. So if you look at the testosterone levels of black people and any other race, the overlap is so great that it's nearly identical. Like there might be I don't actually know if this is empirically validated or if there's been research done on this, but the differences are probably so small that the overlap would be in like the 90+ percentiles. So even though that there are at the very far end maybe some black athletes who have kind of like a extreme amount of testosterone, which then helps them to run faster, or there's something about muscle structure or something like that. The overlap is So much so that if we actually divided up leagues by race, that we'd actually find basically the same results. Because as we know in every sport, there is like a mix-up of the different races. Well, most races. So yeah, right. So then, if you look at the distribution between cis females and trans females, the testosterone distribution are no overlapping at all, even a little bit. There is no overlap at all, and so we see the performances, the performance gaps, which are very large in some sports. Others, they're making the top 10, top whatever. But the point is that there are two groups, and there's one group that is systematically higher on some trait than the other group. Like absolutely, like there's no. I'm just going to reiterate. Cis females have average testosterone rates of 0.13 to 2 nanomoles per liter. Trans athletes, if they go through male puberty, the average is between 7 nanomoles per liter and 30. And there are not many athletes that are actually at 75% of athletes are over 10. So there's like at least usually, even if they are the elite female athletes and like an average or lower level male athlete, there's still like at least a 5 times amount testosterone difference. And the only time that this is gapped that female athletes are near the male distribution is from intersex kind of disorders, genetic disorders, where androgen amounts are much higher. And I also think that there should be kind of controls on that as well, but that's a different topic. But yeah.
Have you looked into the statistics around like how many black athletes come like really fucking high in placement in running?
I agree, but I'm not talking about outcome. I'm talking about ability to reach
no,
that
there
level.
seems to be a significant genetic advantage for certain ethnicities within running, right?
On average, but not absolutely.
I would caution that
not
just,
on average,
I don't know if that's necessarily if it's significant genetic ability, but there may be some, yeah. Just that word is a little scary, but go ahead.
Yeah,
No,
I think
I
that
mean,
you're trying to draw a distinction where there isn't one. I think that the quantitative difference is so large that it goes over the level of fairness that we hold to, which is PEDs.
Okay.
Well,
So
hey,
you're-
real quick for this analogy. So what Vivian is saying is like, let's say that we had a certain activity. Let's say that we had a certain did you say the an anaerobic activity is where the biggest advantage is present, right? I imagine.
Yes.
Yeah. So the largest, let's say that you had an anaerobic activity, and in that anaerobic activity, let's say 95% of the people that were taking medals and winning were trans women, right? You would say that that's probably a problem, I imagine, right, Hound? Yeah. So if we say that same thing exists, now you're not saying that all trans women will beat all cis women, or that no cis women could ever win first. They could, but there would still be a significant advantage there on average. So what Vivian is saying, well, let's look at certain like even certain aerobic events, or I think sprinting I think would be considered an aerobic event. If we look at something like sprinting, and we see that the majority of the winners there are Kenyan, right? I think in the Olympics are typically the ones that do the best there. Like 95% of the winners there are Kenyan. Do you think there should be some separation there, a different category created for them because they seem to have some, even if it's just a slight genetic advantage there that gives them an edge at the top?
My kind of thing, again, I'd go back to the fact that
So yeah, I kind of missed their point here, but they're basically saying is that if you look at the practicality of things, you're saying that trans athletes place well in cis female sports, but they don't dominate and they don't overwhelm the sport. So if you look at different sports where black athletes do better than white athletes systematically, how is that any different? I would basically just say that there is a mechanism for trans athletes to do systematically better. And so again, it's just a numbers game. How many trans athletes are in the sport, and then you just the probability that they're going to be in a much higher place is exponentially higher than a black athlete in some sport where black athletes traditionally dominate. So again, it just comes down to like how much are you willing to be like, okay, there is an advantage, but we just don't care because there isn't that much of a practical application. It just, I don't know, people have different lines and how many trans athletes in first, second place, third place, top 10s that people care about.
the female testosterone difference is unbridgeable, and there's no average genetic difference between the Kenyans and any other race that isn't unbridgeable. There'll always be an athlete that could hit that level. Whether or not they come out in performance, I mean the actual biological mechanism.
Wait, can you explain that again?
So basically, a trans athlete goes through male puberty, they have between 7 to even possibly 20 more times the amount of testosterone. This isn't achievable, but it's not even in the same range for a cis athlete. So what I'm saying is that the difference is that for the Kenyan athletes, there is no level which they have, which isn't logically achievable by any other race.
Do we care more about the hormones or more about the results? Like, let's say that everything you're saying is true, even in humans, but let's say that trans athletes just aren't really. Let's say that about 1% of the population is trans, and let's say when we start looking across all like Olympic medal winners and population finishes, let's say about 1% of them are trans. Do you think it's still a problem at that point?
Depends on, depends on how high up. I mean, you just go back down to the rules. I understand we're doing.
Yeah, so I guess I just wasn't receptive to this point for some reason, but yeah, basically, he is right. Why should we care if it's not actually a borne-out problem, even if they have a mechanism which they're doing better? And I guess from a societal perspective, it's probably better that we don't care. Being a viewer of the sport, but I mean, if you just look at the different perspectives, like, I guess it kind of sucked for the athletes at least to know that there is someone with a systematic advantage competing in your sport. So I don't know how much weight we put on those values or those perspectives, but he is right that if the practicality isn't there, then what really is the problem? Yeah.
Kind of like a utilitarian kind of weighing the cost and the benefit here, but I feel like sports itself are kind of based on a deontological framework of these is the kind of the rules that we have. We kind of want to,
well, yeah. So
the spirit of sport. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah. So just to clarify, so what Vivian's original point was that you're saying you're taking this approach to where there's like a spirit of rule in the game, and what Vivian's argument is that you've chosen to draw this distinction around levels of androgen, but we could theoretically pick, rather than hormones, we could pick some genetic markers and put a barrier around that as well. The example that I give that I think is a little bit more tangible would be height in the NBA. Like, should there be different groupings of height in the NBA? Because it seems to be more competitive when you're taller and you don't really have, aside from getting proper nutrition as a child, and even that arguably you don't control, you don't really have much control over that. So Vivian's question is, why draw it over androgen versus any other random genetic marker? Why pick a hormone instead of a gene or something?
Oh, okay. So because what I was explaining is that there is no height that I say, if you're going to do it, break it down by race, that a black athlete could get to, that theoretically a white athlete couldn't get to.
Yeah, but you can't. Okay, but jeez. But we're talking about the difference between like short and tall people here. We're not talking about like the difference between white and black people now, right? Like, height is a good example that Destiny used. I went for the most fucking like controversial one, but like obviously it seems that in the NBA, like, height is incredibly fucking important, right? Like, no 5'4" fucking person is going to be competing in the NBA.
Well, careful, it happens. It's just very, very, very rare. Just, you don't get no technicality.
I can't think of any 5'4" person in the NBA, but maybe I don't know enough about the NBA. But it's incredibly important, right? So this means that you've got a whole class of people that are basically unable to compete entirely, right? Simply because of like their genetic characteristics, right? Things that are unchangeable, immutable. You can't train to get taller, right? So like, why make this distinction around height and not around? Make this distinction around.
Where what do I set here to make them to make them cut trees? Is it not plant cut? What is it? I don't see chop wood here.
I believe that the testosterone matters.
Yeah, I honestly think the degree of impact is like much greater in terms of height, right? Like, the idea that somebody who's less than 6 foot is probably much less likely to be able to compete in the NBA than a cis woman, for example, is able to compete in any sport that like trans women are competing in. Do you think there's like a 36%? You said something like that, right? With weightlifters, there's like a 36% difference between like cis males and cis females? What?
Okay, so I actually thought about this a lot, and still didn't get it at the beginning, didn't get it, and like there doesn't seem like there's something wrong here, and I can't actually tell. And again, the reason is because of, and this goes back to kind of their central point, is the practicality of it. So are there groups of 5'5" basketball players and groups of 7-foot basketball players only? No, there isn't. But if there's no in between, there's just 5'5" or 7 foot, then obviously I think we should make a 5'5" league and a 7-foot league. But the problem is it's a sliding scale. There's variation in the height of basketball players, obviously, which centers around a very tall height, but there's just so many increments going. So there's nowhere you draw the line where you'd be like, okay, this side is this level of fairness and this side is this level of fairness. The middle is the most where most of the athletes are. Whereas in the situation that we're actually talking about between trans and cis females, it's not like that. It actually is like there are 5'5" cis females and 7-foot trans athletes in terms of testosterone amount. Like that's the level of difference, and the only in betweens are kind of like genetic abnormalities, and there aren't that many of them. Now, again, the reason why we can't just divide up the league is because, or divide up the leagues, is because there aren't enough of the trans athletes. So there wouldn't actually be a league. So we'd just be saying, you know, you're kind of screwed. But then now we just say that there are, you know, on average, you know, 5'5" to maybe in some very good cis female athletes, 6 foot. And then there are also 7-foot athletes. They're just here as well. There's a certain amount of them. So there's a clear difference in how they are, but you just let them compete because there aren't that many of them, basically. And so, I mean, I guess you can argue that because if inclusivity is like the central thing you're looking for, then yeah, you know, you want to include as many people as possible. But it's important to realize that they do have an advantage and that a lot of people are uncomfortable with that advantage.
What do you think is the difference in performance?
What? Hello?
Okay, my dog was fucking barking, so I yelled, and I have a mute push to mute button, so I pressed it, but I don't know why it didn't mute. So anyways, I just fucking screamed at them, and everyone was saying like, was he saying mom or like fucking? I don't even know. No, I was just yelling my dog's name. Her name is Shiloh.
Whoa, holy shit, what was that?
Oh, sorry, Chris.
Very difficult to like quantify, but do you honestly think that the difference between somebody who is like 5'5" higher than 7 foot in the NBA, do you think that the difference in performance in general there is like 36%, or do you think it's probably much higher?
Oh, I see. Okay. I see what you're doing here. You're focusing on the individuals. That's why this whole conversation is.
I'm not
based around.
focusing on the individuals. I'm focusing on the groups. The group of people who are like I don't know, let's say 5'6" and below, and the group of people who are 7 foot and above, right? Do you think there's a difference in general in their performance in the NBA, right, of like 36%, or do you think it's probably much higher?
It's likely much higher. It's for sure much higher.
Right. Okay. I agree. We probably don't have stats on this, but I think it's pretty clear to see that it would be much higher, right?
Right.
So why don't we say that like you know, we need a different division for people of all different heights and a different
I mean, I don't know. I guess for basketball it'd be hard because they're shooting and there are tons of people who are shorter who can shoot well. But I'm just thinking of a sport where this wouldn't be the case, where you just had a dunk or something like that.
Sorry, I don't. What you're gonna have to repeat your point there. I don't understand what you just said.
I just meant that like you can be a good NBA player and be short because of the shooting factor. You can be really good at shooting and you don't need to be tall.
Right.
Well, not really, right? Like that might be true. Like that might be true, maybe in very very one-offs. But in general, I think the average height of an NBA player, I want to say, is like 6'5". It's insanely tall.
Definitely super tall.
Yeah.
100%. Oh, sorry, can you repeat your question again? I'm just trying to wrap my head around it.
6'7". Sorry.
Okay. Really simply, right?
Yeah.
The group of people that are 5'5" and below, and the group of people that are 7 foot and above. The advantage between the difference in performance between them, right, is, I think we both agree, much larger than the difference between trans women and cis women in any sport, right?
Right.
Okay, cool. As long as we agree with that premise. So,
I just think that you drawing the line at that is kind of cherry picking.
I mean, why is it not cherry picking when you're talking about testosterone?
Because there are two kind of distinct groups we're looking at here with like averages.
I can see two distinct groups: people who are less than 5'6" and people who are greater than 7 foot.
Yeah, so basically, she's not building a practical or meaningful difference between these groups. So there's no practical application where 5'5" people and 7 foot people are distinct groups in the NBA, as I already went over. And yeah, it's not meaningful like the trans and cis debate because there are these huge differences between these athletes that are kind of happening right now. And we do see that bear out in performance differences. Yeah.
Those are two distinct groups. You can definitely, like, that's a solid freaking line that you can divide people into.
Okay, but now we're not talking about elite athletes. We're just talking about random people in the street, right? Why would we?
I mean, we're not talking about elite athletes right now because everybody 5'6" and below, or the vast majority of people 5'6" and below, just literally cannot compete at all, right? If you're 5'6" in college and you're like, I really want to be a basketball player, and you train really, really fucking hard, chances are you're still probably not going to make it, right?
Right.
Whereas, like, if you're 7 foot and above and you train really, really fucking hard, you're much more likely to make it, right?
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Cool. So what we're saying is that people who are 5'6" and below are basically shut out of the NBA, pretty much. whereas cis women don't seem to be shut out of any of these sports, right? So it seems much more pressing to me to start making new categories based around height, because height seems to have much more of an effect on sport than like.
Depending on the sport.
I know we're just using the NBA as an example here, but like there's other sports in which height has plays a particularly large advantage as well. Things like the high jump and so on. I had a list a couple of months ago, but yeah. Like I say, I haven't talked about this for a while. All my evidence is all over my computer.
I understand your point.
You're not
I
saying.
understand your point. I just don't.
Oh, you understand it. Okay, cool.
Understand it. I just don't understand kind of why this is completely relevant.
So what Vivian is saying is that you've drawn a distinction around androgen or testosterone. This is the thing that you're taking into account. You've identified two groups, we call them roughly male and female, that have different levels of androgen, and you think that there ought to be a separator here to keep sports fair. But it looks like, in the purposes of, say, long-distance running, we could draw groups around, like, Kenyans and non-Kenyans. Or for basketball, we could draw circles around people that are above 6'4" and below 6'4". And that in some of these cases, the advantages on those people seem even more extreme. That the chances of a cis woman beating a...
Okay, here, so when he said below 6'4" and above 6'4", the problem is that the line blurs. And so what is the difference between 6'3" and 6'4" in performance? That's all totally up to individual differences and stuff like that. That's not a meaningful distinction. And with the Kenyans versus other athletes thing, that might actually have a bit more of a point in that, because I do know that there are a ton of Kenyans and Ethiopians who win marathons and long distance Olympic running, but again, it's not absolute, and again, the physiological reasons, as far as I know, aren't anything that are like super physiological, like they would, like how the testosterone levels are for trans athletes, puberty. So that wouldn't be comparable.
Trans woman is actually much higher than a basketball team full of 5'5" players against 6'7" players. So the question is, what is the justification for creating entirely different divisions based on the androgen thing when we wouldn't do the same for different races in long distance running or different heights of people in basketball playing, I guess, would be the question.
See. Again, all I would say is that the quantitative difference between a trans woman and cis woman in testosterone kind of, for some reason, your argument isn't salient. I don't know why it's not picking up with me, but it doesn't seem like it's practical in any way that the situation or how things actually are right now.
Well, so an analog to how it can be practical is in combat sports. We usually have weight classes. Couldn't we instill like more of those classes across almost every single sport? Like, for instance, why don't you have height classes in the NBA? Why don't you have a 5'5" to 5'8" league, and then like a 5'9" to 6'2" league, and like 6'3" to 6'7" league? Kind of like how, or for marathon running, why don't we have like a Kenyan league, an Ethiopian league, an American league?
So this better kind of gets at his point. Again, you'd have to empirically prove the mechanistic and performance advantage between the lines drawn in the heights for, like, say for basketball or something like that. Like, why do we have a 5'4" to 5'8" league, and how is that different from the 5'9" to 6'1" league? Like, is there an extreme difference between those two? I don't think so. I think you can do that for each different one, each different grouping of people, to show that there is a blending, and there might be a level of like 6'5", which is the perfect height, because when you're super fucking tall, it's hard to move really quick. You're not that agile, like Shaq fucking bumbling all over the place. What were the other examples?
League and like 6'3" to 6'7" league, kind of like how, or for marathon running, why don't we have like a Kenyan league, an Ethiopian league, an American league?
Again, you'd have to prove the empirical differences between, first, the mechanistic biological differences between the groups of people. So what is it that Kenyans or Ethiopians have that other races don't have? Is that like an actual empirical difference? Like, what do the normal distributions of those traits look like on each of the races? And as far as I know, that's not the same as it would be with trans athletes.
Yeah, I haven't actually thought about this at all.
I just don't see why we, and if you agree with the statement, for example, right, that like trans women are women, which I assume from your disclaimers at the beginning that you do agree with that, right? And the you know, the IOC and the various sports organizations also agree with that, because they determine basically sex based on your legally recognized gender in the country, in your country of residence. Then, like, when you're not talking about somebody taking an exogenous substance, right? When they're not deliberately cheating in order to gain this competitive advantage, when they are in fact taking exogenous substances which reduce their performance ability, I can't see how you could say, well, we should exclude them because of this particular genetic factor. They're still women, so you've got to have like a good reason that this genetic factor is more important to you than any other genetic factor.
I guess just the raw ability which it conveys on individual.
Yes, I'm
maybe
sure.
certain races and like certain types of like athletic events.
Yeah, I
that's
just
my
keep
point.
going over my
You've
argument.
just demonstrated that like other genetic
Because
components.
I couldn't kind of put this into cogent thoughts in the moment.
A much greater advantage. So if we're not regulating those, why is this particular one that you want to regulate special?
Let's see. I haven't actually thought about this. I really don't know how to respond.
Okay, so I have a question for Vivian. Would you have a problem if we got to the point to where 50 to 70% of all of the cis women's world records started to be held by trans women? Do you think that would become problematic?
Yes.
If we were to reach that point, let's say that we so we're going down a hypothetical road. Let's say that we have normalized trans.
I mean, I already have a problem with how like sports is done at the moment anyway, right? I think that
sure, but we have to work. We're not going to dismantle all sports, right? It's a part of culture. It's probably here to stay for the foreseeable.
Yeah, no,
future.
I don't want to dismantle.
So we have to work within, whether we think it's dumb or not. We have to work within that confine. So if we accept trans women into all forms of women's sports, if we reach an area in the future where say like 40, I mean, I'm not going to hold you to a particular number, like 15.7%.
Yeah,
let's say we get to like 10%, 20%, 30%, and it's starting to look like holy shit, trans women are fucking destroying cis women in sports. Like they're beginning to become a big record holder. Even 25% would be pretty significant given how small trans are as a percentage of the population. At that point, do you just desegregate them, or no? I'm sorry, do you just segregate? You're like, okay, well, never mind, you guys are all out. Your records are invalidated. Like, how do you deal with it at that point?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would already argue that the rules that we currently have are unfair, right? And that if we were to make significant changes to the rules, like that would stop that from like ever happening. I don't think that that's a likely thing to happen anyway. But let's say the amount of trans people keeps increasing, and suddenly it's like 50% of the population, and they're hitting all the fucking podiums in the women's category, and cis women can't compete. Then absolutely, right? Because my whole position from the very beginning has always been that if we are to talk about how to segregate sport in a different way, we should do it from a point of inclusivity, right? Currently, cis women are not being excluded from sport. I believe trans women actually are being excluded from sport.
Well, inclusivity. If we go by,
I guess it kind of means on what level you put on inclusivity in sport. Like what level is tolerable for you for being pushed out of a sport. Because for some people, one athlete being pushed out is a problem. Like I don't know if anyone remembers. Where was this? Somewhere in the U.S. there was this track athlete that lost the 100-meter dash, and there were two trans athletes in their high school level, and like she was the last level to get the state, or she was the last place that just pushed her out of being or going to the state championship, and the trans athletes got that opportunity, and so her whole case was based on the fact that like she was like, well, I got fucked because of this, so that would technically be exclusion. But I know just for Vivian, that's not a relevant level of exclusion for her. It's more about like there's literally just top 10 is all trans in the sport, and so again, it just comes down to like, well, that would be like I'd be like that's way too far for me at least. But I'm starting to realize that the level that we're at isn't too far for me. There are a couple trans athletes that are doing really well and doing amazing in a bunch of different sports. But it's not an overwhelming amount. So I don't know what my line would be, to be honest. But it's definitely not that far where it's basically just there are trans athletes sweeping every podium. So yeah.
Earlier things like inclusivity in and of itself isn't usually a worthy goal. It's usually something that's serving another end. Do you agree with that or disagree with that? Well, you have to agree with this, because if you say you disagree, then I'm going to say, should we be more inclusive of every single weight class competing against every other weight class, like in a combat sport? And people would say, well, okay, no, in that case, being disclusive or excluding people from certain competitions is probably a good thing. Or should all female and male sports be mixed together? Well, no, it's probably going to have some level of separation there, right?
Yes, Jesse made a great point here, is that inclusivity has a limit. So like, why can't men just be included in the women's category? Well, because that's like too inclusive. That's hyper inclusive. We need an inclusive that also balances fairness, and so there's a balance between fairness and inclusivity. She just is higher up on the fairness or the inclusivity than fairness. I'm just the opposite. So I guess it's just more of like a fundamental difference in our values and the positions we take on sport.
I'm not sure about the all female and male sports being mixed together. In all honesty, I think there's a possibility that that could be done if
I
you
think
had
across
like
well,
certain weight classes, or if you had certain like leagues or whatever. But like, it's a very it's pretty complicated shit.
yeah, it might be
Um,
possible, but you would have to start drawing way more restrictions in order to
yeah,
make that work,
exactly.
right? Like the worst male NBA team could probably destroy the best female WNBA team like 30 times. Like it would be an insane.
Probably,
Yeah.
mostly from the height difference, actually.
Sure,
because-
yeah, or even
What
I mean,
the
it's been
fuck is
demonstrated in
happening right
tennis as well, right? But so yeah, so it seems like some level of exclusion is probably good to make sports somewhat competitive. For the
Yeah.
Holy fuck, that was weird. I could not play this video. Okay, yeah. So, what did this thing just say? Fuck. What was I talking about?
I mean, but
demonstrated in tennis as well, right? But so
Oh yeah. Okay, so like, when she said she wasn't sure about men's and men and women competing in the same league, that would be an absolute catastrophe. There are like 99% of the sports, it would be dominated by men, 100%. No doubt in my mind about that. Even if you divvy it up by weight class, it doesn't matter. So, yeah, I think that if you already keep the level of inclusivity below that, then again, this is just one or a couple steps below that. It really is just a couple steps below that. And so I find that a problem, basically.
But yeah, so it seems like some level of exclusion is probably good to make sports somewhat competitive. For the
yeah, I mean, but it's exclusion in the name of inclusion, right? The reason that we exclude certain categories, certain people from a category, is in order that other people can compete, right?
Yeah.
It's always in the name of inclusivity, right? It's always in the name of like having the maximal amount of people being able to compete. Not everybody, right?
Well, no, that's actually one perspective on it, but the other perspective is that we hold fairness as something inherently good and inherently important in sports, and so if we see a group that can't bridge this level of fairness, then we do things about it. That's exactly the reason why Caster Semenya had her case against her, because we saw that there possibly could be an unbridgeable gap, and so the IOC did something about it.
Yeah.
But the maximal amount of people being able to compete, yeah. So the answer to your question is yes. If trans women started dominating, I would be okay with a new league, and that new league would actually have a chance of fucking succeeding at that point as well, right? If you've got all champion like trans athletes and there's shitloads of them around, then maybe you could have another league. But currently, if you're talking about separating trans women out into another league, you're talking about removing them from sport entirely, because there's just not enough trans women athletes in order to make that league, in order to even put together a fucking race when it comes to things like cycling and so on, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, I think there's about 20 trans cyclists, and only like 2 or 3 of them are coming in like high placings. Yeah.
Where is your line, or like the level at which you'd be like, okay, I'm uncomfortable with level of kind of trans position in sport?
I mean, it's hard to like put an exact line on it, like we said earlier, but I think, but yeah, I mean, they'd have to be pretty dominant, right? You'd have to like start seeing podiums where it's like all trans women and no cis women are like ever included. You'd have to see, instead of just seeing a trans woman win once, like in the case of Dr. Rachel McKinnon with the cycling thing, and then lose like the next 11 races, they would have.
I think I probably should call her out on this, but basically, the competition that Rachel did the best in, as I would have predicted, is the 200-meter dash, or whatever they call it in track cycling. And she's not as good as the long range ones, or the long distance ones, again because of the power advantage gained from male puberty. So yeah,
have to be consistently winning every single race all the time, and that would have to be like across the entire sport with trans women involved.
I
right?
just say my line is less far than yours.
Well, your line seems to be, if some trans women win some of the time, then that's bad, which seems.
No, it's that. I think that there's mechanistic like physiological reasons why they would have an advantage beyond taking drug or something like that, and then like, because of that fact, it's just they'll get higher places than they would have.
Yeah, but again, we're saying sort of.
Yeah, so I kind of missed the point here. Basically, they go back to like the but what about in the real world kind of aspect? Like, okay, that's cool, there's a mechanism, whatever, but how does it actually play out in the real world? And like, if there's one trans athlete in a sport and they have the advantage, then why does it even matter, kind of thing.
the same can be said about height. There's a lot of people that would be way
that's
worse at
true.
basketball if they were a different height, right? Or people that would be way worse at swimming if their body composition was slightly different, like the length of their torso compared to their legs or their arms, right? That they have no control over, and that others have no control over.
I wonder what a short people's league would look like in basketball, honestly.
It'd be good at shooting, probably.
Could be interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
It would definitely change the nature of the game, right? Like the game would like completely change in the way that people play it, for sure.
Hopefully.
Okay,
Yeah, well,
sorry,
yeah,
that's just a side note anyway.
That was pretty much everything I had.
Okay.
Have anything else that you want? Just you want to find out, like.
I mean, no, not really. Just that if trans women are women, they should be able to compete in women's sport, right? And if you're going to exclude them for this reason of like something that their body produces naturally, then it's got to be, you've got to have that consistent policy across all naturally occurring like things within somebody's body, right?
So first of all, the trans women are women thing is kind of a cop out because of course trans women are women, but women have different experiences in life, and they have, that includes biological experiences, and so they group. So cis women have typical biological experiences which are much different in general from trans women, and not even in general, almost absolutely. There's very little crossing, especially or depending on what time, what age the trans woman transitioned. So that's not a good analogy for actually looking at, okay, what are the biological traits? If you say woman or woman, you're kind of saying they have woman biology. They're women, they have woman biology. So what's the problem? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't consider something where it's like it's actually not naturally occurring for cis women to have testosterone levels higher than 2 nanomoles per liter? Like you wouldn't find that be an unnatural?
I mean, it does naturally occur though. What are you talking about?
Not in like 46XX cis women like that.
You mean,
like
no 46XX woman has testosterone levels of over 2 nanomoles per liter?
Well, not 2 nanomoles per liter, but like that's like the 99 percentile. Like
I mean,
go above that is usually hypergonadism, and it's like a form of intersex.
Actually meant hypergonadism. But yeah, there is no 46XX females that have levels above like 2. Like that's like hitting the pinnacle of usually athletic ability. A lot of like really fat athletes are at that level. But beyond that, it's usually caused for some outside genetic influence.
I mean, some of the time, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, we still consider those intersex people women, right? Like.
Yeah, I understand,
Sure.
but I would.
So I guess I don't know why I didn't push back on this, but of course we consider them women, but that's not actually the point. What I'm trying to say is that the differences between the sexes are quantifiable and absolute. They really are absolute. And so when you say, okay, well, there's intersex people, and we consider them women. Well, that's true, but I would also consider putting restrictions on the level of testosterone that they have.
So
Also,
yeah.
I would also,
Even if it's naturally occurring.
but I would also say that they.
So you want to divide people up by chromosomes?
No, by
Okay.
for advantage, performance
By testosterone advantage. Yeah.
advantage that varies from testosterone.
That specifically conveys from testosterone?
Yes.
See, I would much rather divide people up by just advantage, right? Like by the combined advantage of all of their genetic traits, right? That like places them in a particular category, like in a particular kind of broad category of performance. I would much rather divide them up in that way, rather than specifically focusing upon like height or endogenous testosterone or whatever. I'd much rather divide people up by just performance, and I don't think there's any reasonable justification to focus in on specifically the testosterone that they once had in their blood.
Yeah, there definitely is a justification, and I told you why the justification is. But it is true that if you kind of want to know how an athlete does, you have to take a holistic perspective. And when you look at it from a holistic perspective, there is tons of overlap. So, I mean, yeah, that is true. I just, again, I think testosterone is in a league of its own in terms of actual like performance enhancement. There's nothing that compares to it, and the fact that it is so important as an athletic molecule, and then pair that with the difference between the two groups, I think that is cause for concern.
Well, I
Bonus
think that,
bonus
I've
mean
already seen
XQC lost to
there
Obi
might
Pepe
be
laugh.
that grow from having testosterone in your body and training. proceed throughout your life.
Yeah, and none of these, the advantage conferred by height continues throughout your life as well. It's pretty rare for a
Right.
person to like get significantly shorter during their lifespan. So
Yeah, I guess there's just no such thing as like a height growth machine which people could just use, whereas there are things like steroids which
mean,
athletes do use and which are banned.
You can give somebody
I mean,
HGH as they're growing up to give them.
Yeah. Could do that. Could do that.
That would also be wrong, right?
I mean, not necessarily, right? Because if they don't have any of it in their blood by the time they get to, by the time they get to competing, like they're not going to be picked up on any doping tests or whatever. Take HDS during puberty.
Okay.
But that would be an exogenous substance as well. Yeah.
Well, what if like a bunch of different parents spread out over the world decided to like get a doctor to if their children have like genetic advances in sports? The children go to play the sports, and then they find out that they had some kind of innate advantage given to them, which is unachievable by the general population. What would you think of that?
Okay, so what I actually try to say here, might kind of a fuck ton, is that imagine that there are like a society of parents that decide that they want to have their kids to be super physiologically good at a certain sport. So they get like a doctor or something like that to give children, literally say a steroid or something like that, in their birth that will stay with them their whole life or something like that. And then they go and let them play the sport. And then they want to play the sport. What do we say to them? Because they didn't choose this, but they still want to play the sport, but they still have a super physiological difference. And there's a systematic pattern. So you know the group of people who it is, say it's some weird cult or something like that. Like how would you deal with that? If you'd say it's fine, then it just comes down to a numbers game. Like what if it's like there's like, I don't even know, like thousands of them, and then they start to dominate the sport, or at least like be much higher place on average compared to their actual number in the population. Like then what would you do?
I mean, that's sort of in a roundabout way how they do scouting for athletes in college now, isn't it? Like they go and they look for people who are like the best of the best in the collegiate level, and then they take them to professional, right?
Yeah, but I'd say yeah, like you know,
more
like
like
the doctor, the
XQC,
advantage
fuck
that they
you,
give them is something that's
XQC.
not biologically achievable.
Oh, what, they get a doctor to go and give them a substance which gives them?
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I don't. I wouldn't be for that, obviously. My point is.
So if she, I don't know what she meant by wouldn't be for that. If she means like I wouldn't be for that and I wouldn't let them compete, then she's kind of contradicting herself when it comes to trans athletes. But she could also say that, well, we'd have to do something to get the parents to stop doing this legally or something like that because that's a problem. But yeah.
I think it's wrong. For example, with the case of Casta Semenya, you know about her, right? She had a disorder of sexual development. I believe it was XY gonadal dysgenesis, but I can't.
XQC lost to a B can't even CD.GG. Bonus me or you are
so she naturally
YAYA.
produced like more testosterone and uptook more testosterone than sort of the average cis woman, right?
Right.
And the IOC and the IAAF like saw fit to exclude her from sport on that basis, unless she took substances to reduce her ability to compete, essentially. And I'm kind of against that violation of somebody's like autonomy to that degree. I believe that, as the IOC says, sport is a human right, right? And I don't think that we should be forcing people to take exogenous substances in order to be able to compete in the categories that they.
So this kind of then would invalidate her ideas on the category differences between males and females, because if it's the case that it's naturally occurring and it's okay, then what's say in the future there's a way for us to have trans athletes to have feminization procedures without lowering the levels of testosterone at all. Then what? They have the same testosterone as they did when they were male. It's naturally occurring though, and they identify as female. So you know what is the actual problem?
They want to compete. That's my.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can see your position now better when you gave the high example. I just think that I don't know, if we're going to value not taking PDs in a sport, then it just seems like if there are
Well, yeah, but again, we're talking about exogenous versus endogenous, right? We're talking about somebody deliberately taking a substance to give them a performative advantage, right?
Well, right, but then what's the problem? Again, as I just said, what's the problem with allowing an athlete who transitions but doesn't want to lower their levels of testosterone? Why is that a problem then? It's endogenous. It's just their levels of testosterone. So what's the problem?
Right. which would mean that basically everybody in that sport would have to then take that substance, otherwise they're just not going to be able to compete. It's like one of the major problems with like early bodybuilding and all that sort of shit, right? That's why so many.
And so this kind of, I guess, again, comes to the numbers, because if we believe that the advantage given to trans athletes through puberty is like a massive amount of testosterone, then you can make the same case that for other athletes to compete in some sports, power sports, right now, they would also have to take steroids. But that doesn't happen. And so, yeah, it's a weird situation.
Many bodybuilders fucking died because they were like hopped up on steroids all the time.
I see. So the intent kind of something that you think is extremely important?
Sorry?
The intent of the athlete?
Oh, the intent. No, I don't necessarily think it's the intent. I mean, everybody wants to have that competitive advantage. That's the whole point of training. It's the outside influence, right? The pressure for somebody to like literally take substances that could harm them, in order to be able to compete with other people. And when the sports organizations say that is necessary, right? You absolutely must do that, or you can't compete. That's pretty fucked to me, especially.
But then, yeah, okay. As I said before, same thing that would happen with a trans athlete that doesn't want to take testosterone suppressing substances. It's the exact same thing. It's endogenous. What's wrong? If she thinks that there's nothing wrong with endogenous substances or endogenous levels of hormones, then there's nothing wrong with an athlete not actually transitioning their testosterone.
Especially if you consider sport a human right in the same way that myself and the IOC do.
I do consider it a human right, but I don't think it's a human right to allow them to, or allow anyone to participate in any category they want to. Right? So that's why I believe that. I think this is a justified division if we made, as I said before, like a regulated category.
Any justified division has to not exclude, right? Because at this point you're talking about discriminating against trans women in such a way as to make their ability to compete unviable. Like,
so this was, I guess a kill shot on her side is that actually is true, is that the burden of proof to be able to discriminate someone has to be really, really high. I did show that, but then what we'd basically be doing is discriminating against trans people on something that they can't control because they don't choose to be trans, if you believe that, which I do. And that's not fair at all. Or the alternative would be to send them to the men's category. But I don't know how I feel about that either. I feel like that would be extremely degrading, and would probably, send their gender dysphoria for a fucking run. So yeah, it's not easy how to figure out how to deal with this situation, but it's hard because there is an unfairness, and it does exist, and the unfairness conferred from trans athletes isn't the same as what happens. It's not the same as just the endogenous testosterone levels of female athletes, because they had those levels their whole lives, whereas there is a choice in the fact that when you transition and compete in sports, it's almost like you're kind of signing up for the rules that are laid out there, but then it just comes into conflict with the practicality argument, and then of course the human rights argument.
Just wouldn't be a place for them in sport if you were to exclude them from these cis women's sports, because they're not going to compete against men, and competing against men, I would argue, would be an affront to their dignity in general, right? It would be a denial of their womanhood. So and putting them out into a separate category, if you're talking about like a category for like trans women, then you'd have very few competitors. If you want to do a category specifically for trans people, you've got trans men who are allowed to take exogenous testosterone, trans women who aren't. Trans men are going to dominate, trans women aren't going to have a place there. So whatever you do, you're talking about like removing them from sport entirely. And so my solution is, until they get to that point that Destiny was describing earlier, where like they're forcing cis women out of sport and cis women can no longer compete in much the same manner, then there's no reason to change the categories.
Okay, I guess I guess my line for that would be much or closer than yours would be.
Yeah, and what's your justification for like placing the line so low?
Well, again, because I value fairness more than you do, obviously, and don't value inclusivity as much, especially in elite sports. Like, of course, on the ground level, we're not going to do this on like any lower level recreational sporting events, but this is kind of the highest of the high, and it matters. It actually matters who wins and who loses in different sports. So I just think that we should try to keep that as fair as we can. That inclusivity isn't the central variable that we're thinking about in mind when people are playing the sports. But
well, I believe that the advantage is.
Good job. You did it without screaming at each other. I'm proud of both.
My same argument. The advantage is beyond what.
Yeah, and then we get back into the height thing and blah blah blah. All right, fair enough.
Okay, well,
that's pretty circular.
Good
Okay.
job. You did it without screaming at each other. I'm proud of both of you. Okay.
Hey, I never scream at anybody, Destiny.
I'm not a screamer to begin with.
yeah, I was kind of
Are
surprised.
you friends with a person?
Most of the debates I've seen Vivian with, she's like fucking gone off on people. So I don't know if I was just more chill of a debate interlocutor or what happened, but yeah, it was a pretty good debate. Hold on, is this over pretty much?
What, me?
Cyber Witch Lexi?
Oh, we had a massive falling out a while ago, and I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that she says, especially around anarchism and so on.
Okay, just kidding. All right,
Would you be willing to come back on again, Vivian?
But I do know her, and I do have open. I'm supposed to be having a conversation with her at some point to try and like sort out our differences.
Sure.
So,
Okay.
Hey, Vivian, would you be able to, or would you want to come back on? I like kind of went over this and thought that I still had my same opinion and kind of thought about it. Would you be willing to have another conversation?
Yeah, sure. Just like hit me up when I'm streaming sometime, and we can have like a little 20-minute, half-an-hour conversation or something. I won't require you to get Destiny to moderate next time.
All right, awesome. I understand why.
Okay. Thank you for hosting, Destiny.
Yeah, no
You
problem.
have a good day, all right, buddy?
Right.
And you too, Hannah Forge. Have fun.
Yeah.
Peace
Thanks,
out.
you too.
Bye.
Yeah, really. Bye.
Oh, good job. We did it. Holy shit, dude! Okay. I think streaming and doing research at the same time is just really, really, really hard. I was worried that I was like losing my mind, but I did like reading off stream last night, and it was so much easier.
You just doesn't give a fuck. He doesn't say shit about it. Okay, yeah. So first debate, I guess it went all right. Didn't go in the direction I thought I was going to go. Again, I thought that she would kind of double down on the differences in actual performance, which I don't understand if she's read more into it and learned that there are differences in performance, because the previous debate with Destiny that she 100% doubled down on that position. When raised to the fairness point, which I guess is a valid point, and I mean, to be able to strip someone's human rights is kind of a fucking super shitty thing to do. So, yeah, it really comes down to a numbers game, like how many trans athletes end up going in the sport and how many are in the dominating positions. I don't know where my line would be, but I know society's line is much closer to mine than to Vivian's. And so, yeah, so to kind of bring up why I thought this was an important topic to talk about, was because I think that this is going to be like the final point on which society will use against trans people, or not society, but like Christians, fundamentalist Christians, transphobes, stuff like that. This is like this is like easy shit to just make a YouTube video about. You should see all the fitness videos on like the Laurel Hubbard and Mary, I can't remember what her name was, her breaking the record in powerlifting. Because it's really intuitive when you see someone with extremely masculine features competing, and then the other athletes are losing, like these one-off kind of times when like someone who actually is good at weightlifting, Laurel Hubbard, goes in the female category and dominates. People kind of intuitively be like, what the fuck is that about? Like, that can't be fair, that can't be right. So I think rhetorically, the trans movement and people who kind of want to think about this topic, they need to think about how they convey this information to like people who don't know much about the situation, because throwing the human rights argument just in people's faces is not going to work at all. And it's actually probably going to create a lot more people to move in the direction of these kind of like right-wingish kind of like trans people are just trans women are just dudes in dresses, that kind of perspective. Because if they care about this and they go and see a video of someone just bashing a trans athlete without going into the science or the fairness aspects of it or anything, then it's an easy gateway into kind of like the alt-right ideology. So it's important in that respect, and unfortunately, I didn't get that across. But actually, some people thought it was a good debate in Destiny's chat. Anyways, yeah, I probably won't actually call Vivian back again, because I think I went over my arguments here, and even though I think that the height argument is fallacious, and there are still some logical inconsistencies in her thinking, it comes down to the fact that basically barring an athlete from competing at all from a human rights perspective is not a good move. And so until there are enough trans and intersex athletes to make a league on their own that would be successful, or if there's enough cis athletes that want to create a league participating with trans athletes, until that time, then probably just keep it the same, and it just is a fact of nature that trans athletes have kind of this advantage, and cis athletes don't, but there aren't that many trans athletes in the sport. So the actual existential threat to cis females competing in the sports they want to compete in isn't that big. All right, so yeah, that's it for me today. I have a couple other debates planned. I'll see how those go, see if anyone's even interested in them. No one seemed to be too interested in this one, but yeah. Thanks for listening, and